Today's video is a big one and a subject I've gotten a lot of questions on over the years, the jointer. We all know the saying, start square, finish square, and the jointer takes no prisoners. If it isn't set up right or you're using the wrong technique, you won't end up square and you'll be left with nothing but frustration. So let's go over how the jointer works and techniques to get perfectly straight and square material. For this video, I've removed some of the safety guards to show how the jointer works. Make sure you use all safety guards with your jointer. There are 4 main parts to the jointer: the in-feed table, the out-feed table, the fence, and the cutter head. Now this video is not about setting up your jointer. That will be another video. But before you use the jointer, here's what needs to be done. First is to make sure the in-feed and out-feed tables are coplanar. That means when the in-feed table is at the same level as the out-feed table, both tables are in a straight line from one end to the other. When you lower the in-feed table, the tables are no longer coplanar, but they must be parallel. This is critical. Next, the knives must be set at the same height as the out-feed table, or within 1/1000th higher. You do not want the knives set lower than the out-feed table. And last, you need to adjust the fence to 90 degrees. Now, before we go over techniques, it's important to understand how a jointer works. The in-feed table is lowered to the desired cut depth. As you pass the board over the knives, it removes material, allowing the out-feed table to support the workpiece. Note that the out-feed table does not fully support the material until it is completely flat. When we go over jointer technique, you'll see why this is very important to understand. Now let's look at the dynamics of the jointer. When you place the material on the table, you'll have the weight of the material and the friction against the surface to overcome. The force needed to move the material is in the horizontal direction. When the material contacts the knives, you will have multiple forces acting on the material in the vertical and horizontal direction. This means a little more force needs to be applied horizontally to counteract the knives, and a small force down over the knives, preventing the board from lifting up. The deeper the cut, the more counterforce you'll need to apply. Now, do you really need to know this to join a board? Yes, because the techniques we use must address these dynamics for the jointer to work properly. Before even turning on the jointer, we need to understand some basic wood terminology and properties, starting with the face. This is the wider, long grain section of a board, and the edge grain is the narrower, long grain section. Now let's look at the 4 main ways wood can warp, starting with a bow. This is warping caused along the grain on the face of the board, creating a shape like a bow. The side of the wood that is under compression is called the concave side, and the side that is under tension is called the convex side. Here's an example. I've drawn stress lines on this foam, which are straight and parallel to each other. When I bend the foam, you can see on the bottom where the lines compress closer together, and the top side, they stretch further apart, called tension. This doesn't mean the bottom is always in compression or that it's always the concave side. I can bend the foam upwards and the compression is now on top and tension on the bottom, making the top the concave side. Next is crook. This is a long grain bow along the edge of the board. The principles are the same for a bow and a crook. One is on the face and one is on the edge. Then you have a cup, which is a bow across the grain, still having all the same properties of compression and tension, just across the grain instead of with the grain. Last is the twist, causing the board to rotate the face out of plane. Now let's look at grain direction. Notice that the cutter head of the jointer spins clockwise from the out-feed table to the in-feed table. This means you want the grain of the wood going clockwise from the top to the bottom of the board as you pass it over the jointer. If you go against the wood, you'll get a much choppier cut with more tear out. Going with the grain slices the wood with less tear out. When jointing a bowed board, you want the concave side down. This gives you 2 points of contact. If you have the concave side up, you only have 1 point of contact, making the board unstable. Another really important dynamic with the jointer is you must not distort the board as you run it over the knives. This can happen when you apply too much downward force. Remember, the only downward force needed is to counteract the knives pushing up, which isn't a lot. And if you distort the board, it will just spring back to its original shape and not be flat. Now, you've probably all seen these foam push sticks. They're practically in every jointer video and come with most jointers when you purchase one. Unfortunately, they are a big reason people have trouble getting boards flat. These pads require way too much downward force to move the material forward. And since we don't need very much downward force, any push stick you use should be designed to push the material forward, like the one you see here. Hooking on the edge of the board transfers the force horizontally and not down. Jointing is actually a finesse job. A light controlled touch is the key. Here's how it should look. Start by identifying the concave side of the board. Then identify the face grain direction. This is done by looking at the edge of the board. The grain should be going down from the top of the board to the bottom, facing the cutter head. Hook your push stick on the back end of the board and place your fingers lightly near the front of the board. You might have noticed I'm being very specific about the pressure. No matter what tool you're using, proper pressure is key. And it's not just about getting good results, it's also about safety. If you're pushing too hard or squeezing too tightly and something were to happen, all that force will be released, making it much more difficult to react and get out of the way of danger. So pay attention to that. It's easy to start tensing up when using machines. Now, if you don't feel comfortable putting your fingers on the board, that's okay. Just use a stick. If you watch the How to Make a Push Stick video, then you know the push stick that comes with your table saw is no good. But instead of throwing it out, you can modify it to work here. You don't need a lot of downward force, and the plastic will slide easily on the board, keeping your hands away from the knives. Then steadily move the board over the knives with your push stick while keeping slight pressure above the blade. Notice I'm not putting pressure on the outfeed side. That's because the board is not yet flat, and you could cause it to twist or bend slightly. Plus, now that you've seen how the jointer works, you can see there's no reason to do this. But wait, there is a situation where this technique can be helpful when jointing a twisted board. To prevent wasting a lot of wood or ending up too thin, you want to balance the twist. But this can cause the board to be unstable. Here's how to safely and accurately joint a twisted board. Once you balance the twist, move the edge of the board against the fence to help stabilize it and run it through the jointer. To ensure the material doesn't move, keep your push stick and hand in a fixed position through the whole pass. Taking a deeper cut on the first pass will help establish a reference surface quickly. Now that you have a flat reference on the bottom of the board, pass the board over the jointer as you normally would, keeping slight pressure over the blade. Now it's time to joint the edge of the board. One step I like to take before jointing the edge is to plane the other face of the board. This allows you to pick what edge you want to joint and still have the right grain direction. You might wonder, why can't you just joint the other side too? This is because the jointer makes a surface flat, but not necessarily parallel. The planer is designed to make a parallel surface referenced off the jointed face, and this is what we want. Now, before you joint the edge, you need to identify the grain direction. This is done by looking at the face of the board. Again, the grain will go from higher to lower, moving away from the cutter head. When you're checking the grain direction for the face, you look at the edge of the board. When you're checking the grain direction for the edge, you look at the face of the board. Now let's look at edge jointing dynamics. It's very similar to face jointing. You want most of your force pushing the board horizontally with only a little downward force to counteract the knives. The main difference is you need to apply enough force to keep the board flat against the fence. This is really important. The table is no longer the reference, only the fence. Ensuring the board stays against the fence is critical. You do not want to apply diagonal force from the top. This has a tendency to push the bottom away from the fence and can easily happen without you noticing it. You need to apply force in the center of the board against the fence. Here's how it looks. Start with the concave side down. Place your fingers on the board in the center and safely above the cutter head, pressing it flat against the fence and push it over the jointer. If the board is really narrow, use your push stick to feed the board and another push stick pressing the board against the fence before the cutter head. And that's how you accurately use your jointer. Now there is some skill involved in this process, and the more you do it, the better you will get. Just remember, the right amount of force is key and a light touch is all you need. Keep the concave side down and the material moving at a steady pace. When edge jointing, make sure you're flat against the fence, make yourself a good push stick, and don't use the foam pads. These tips and techniques should greatly improve your jointing experience. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and I'll see you next time.